And let's finish the 7th chapter of the Wolves of Willoughby Chase. Sylvia and Bonnie have ended up in Mrs. Brisket's very nasty orphan asylum, which she calls a school, but she makes all of the children work day and night and sleep in cold beds. They aren't allowed to talk, and the girls have their hair shaved off. Right now, Sylvia is working, doing the washing at a pump that's loud enough for the girls to talk to one another. When the sheets had been painfully scrubbed and rinsed 3 times by hands that were red and sore from the harsh soap and icy water, Emma showed Sylvia how to use the wringer. "Never touch it with your hands. One girl lost her fingers in it. Now we always poke the sheets through with a stick." She dumped the wrung-out sheets into a basket and carried them out to the yard behind the house, where there were long rows of hen houses and many washing lines. When the sheets were hung up, she and Sylvia returned to the central heap for a new lot. The morning seemed endless. Sylvia was soon exhausted from the heavy work and soaked through with icy water from the wringer, which sprayed anybody who was using it. Presently the bell went for dinner. Sylvia had hoped that as she and Bonnie were both to miss their meal, they might at least meet and talk somewhere, but she learned that people punished in this way were obliged to stand at the back of the dining room and watch everybody else eat. Mrs. Brisket sat at the head table eating grilled trout and plum pudding, and there was no chance to move a finger without being seen by her. Bonnie looked tired and rebellious. She had a smear of coal dust on one cheek, a cut finger, and grease spots on her overall, but she grinned at Sylvia encouragingly. At the end of the meal, she seized the moment when all the benches were noisy and pushed back to whisper, "It wasn't much of a meal to miss anyway." Nor had it been. One thin slice of cold fat pork, a piece of beetroot, and a small withered apple. After dinner, Bonnie was summoned back to the scullery to help with the washing up, and Sylvia and Emma went round with a bell to wake the night workers. Then Sylvia realized that as the beds were insufficient for the number of children in the school, half of them slept by night and half by day. The night workers were always dropping with fatigue, as they were liable to be roused for duties in the daytime too, but just the same they were envied as they performed their task without the fierce supervision of Mrs. Brisket. It was a hard job to waken them. One by one they were clanged out of their slumbers and dragged from their beds. At 2 o'clock sharp the whole school, yawning and shivering, stood lined up in the heartless classrooms. At 2:30 Mrs. Brisket came round with the inspector. The children were well trained. As the door opened into each classroom they burst into chorus, "A, B, C, D, E, F, G," and so on until the visitors had left. In the next room it would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. "Ah, I see they are getting on with their reading and arithmetic, ma'am," said Mr. Friendship, the inspector, comfortably. "Yes, Mr. Friendship, as you see." "As I might have expected from such a well-run establishment as yours, ma'am." "And now, Mr. Friendship," said Mrs. Brisket, when they had passed through the last room, where Bonnie and Sylvia were standing, "come and have a small glass of port wine to keep out the chill." After tea, which Bonnie missed, the children were set to mending. The meal had consisted of another small wedge of bread, dry this time, and a cup of water. Sylvia had contrived to save half of her morsel and bread for Bonnie. Save half of her morsel of bread for Bonnie, and she pushed it into Bonnie's hand later, as they sat working in the biggest classroom, huddled together for warmth. This was the only time of day when they were allowed to talk to each other a little. "The cook's Tartar," whispered Bonnie. "If you say a word—" "The cook's a Tartar," whispered Bonnie. "If you say a word she hits you with the frying pan, or anything that's handy, and the kitchen is filthy. I'd sooner work in a pigsty. We can't stay here, Sylvia." "No, we can't," breathed Sylvia in heartfelt agreement. "But how can we possibly get away, and where would we go?" "I'll think of some plan," said Bonnie, with invincible optimism. "And you think too, Sylvia. Think for all you are worth." Sylvia nodded. Then she whispered, "Hush, Diana Brisket's looking at us," and bent her head over the enormous rent in the satin petticoat which she was endeavoring to repair. They had already learned that Diana Brisket was someone to dread. Her sharp eyes were everywhere, ready to catch the slightest fault, which she would then shrilly report to her mother, and her bony fingers were clever to prod and pinch or twist as she passed on stairs or landing. She was cordially hated by the whole school. After they had sewed or mended For 2 hours they were put to sorting bristles for broom-making, while Mrs. Brisket read aloud a chapter of the Bible to them. Then there was supper, a choice of bluish skim milk or a cup of thin potato soup, and then they were sent to bed, most of them so bone-weary that in spite of hunger and the thin coverings they fell into bed and slept at once the dreamless sleep of exhaustion. And that is the end of chapter 7.